Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet that's caught in a moment of what some are calling the great pause after humanity has been on a great acceleration for the last 50 years, leading to all kinds of global changes and risks and opportunities. This webcast from Columbia University's Earth Institute is aimed at cutting through the noise and finding actionable paths so we can have a least regrets journey through tumultuous times. And there's so many things going on at once, it feels overwhelming to many people out there. The goal here today is to focus on one element of the communication challenges around the vaccine, around the COVID-19 pandemic, and that's vaccination. I have some great guests coming on momentarily. The landscape can feel very noisy, as you can see here. The internet is full of anything you want, basically, and it's designed to give you what you already crave in some ways, and designed to antagonize you sometimes at the same time. But today we'll hear from Heidi Larson, who has been here before. She's from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, has a background in anthropology, but much more applied anthropology and applied to the context of public health and vaccine. Hesitancy is a really old term, I think, in how people think about public reactions to this epic mechanism we have to stem infectious disease. They've flipped it in a very smart way that in itself, I think, is indicative of what we can work on. It's the Vaccine Confidence Project, and measuring vaccine confidence levels in communities around the world is part of what they're working on. We also have Renee DiResta, who's the research director at Stanford's Internet Observatory. I'm really glad there is an Internet Observatory. As I've said, the reason I came to the Earth Institute at Columbia and not the journalism school is because after 35 years of journalism, and then stumbling into this thing called the internet and social communication, I realized it's a new feature of the Earth system. Essentially, it's big and consequential and unknown. It's like a newly discovered ecosystem, and it's a thrill to know people are digging in deep and trying to gauge what to do to cut through the noise, to identify disinformation, active noise, and to understand the public reaction information more generally requires insights from psychology, which is why I'm really glad that Noel Brewer from the University of North Carolina is here too. He's been approaching these questions of vaccine attitudes and interventions and what works and what doesn't work from the context of how individuals react to information. So we're going to have a great conversation here. Going to show you a couple of things. It's a disturbing moment where there's lots of division over what you would think. To many science-focused folks, it just seems like a no-brainer to move ahead as safely as we can with vaccines and to have public acceptance of that. But even public are even fighting over contact tracing, let alone vaccines. So Heidi, maybe we'll start with you. And let me just, if everyone can mute when you're not speaking, that'd be great. Heidi, first of all, you were on here a few weeks ago, and Laurie Garrett led you through a really good discussion of the issues we face and this challenge of having a warp speed vaccine effort right now, literally called warp speed by the United States. And knowing what you know about vaccine attitudes, do you think we're adequately engaged on what needs to be done to anticipate now how to build a more science-based approach to acceptance of that, or gauging what to do?
Well, I think that there's been a lot of momentum in the last few months in different groups around recognizing that we need to get our handle around this. One is the challenges of public trust in science, but I think we also can't forget the human factor, which I think all of us here in the room have been trying to get a handle on. I think that with the warp speed initiative, and the fast aspect has not, I mean, the US uses that term, which is particularly aggressive, but the trying to do fast science is not necessarily what resonates with the public. We learned around H1N1 that one of the reasons that people weren't taking the vaccine then was because they thought it was too fast, too soon, to be safe. And that's a vaccine that, that's another strain of this influenza vaccine, which is a much more familiar vaccine. And this is going to be even less familiar. I think where we need to get going is at starting with, even though we don't have the specs on the final vaccines that will work, because we don't know which will work. But some of the reasons why this is possible to be faster, what are the new platforms? And some of the reasons it can be faster is because of the new technologies for making vaccines and how quickly we were able to characterize the virus, which is a technological positive advance, but we're not. And the other thing is there's a lot of people in the world, not everywhere, but who don't even believe COVID exists. It was made up, and if we don't get the reality of COVID out there, we can forget about persuading people to take a vaccine if they don't even think they need it.
I muted myself because our dog is barking a little bit downstairs. So, Renee, you're looking at this meta impressions and the tools we're using now to communicate so much with Facebook, particularly. And you've been writing a lot for Wired and for The Atlantic on your work dissecting the dynamics of information on that big scale. Can you give a bit of a primer on how this new information environment essentially is problematic, and or what do you do about that?
Sure. So back in late 90s, all of a sudden, the internet became a thing, and everybody had blogs back then, right? So you had a lot of people who had the ability to say whatever whatever they wanted. They could express themselves. Originally, they kind of started out as diaries, but some people did kind of manage to make them into little micromedia environments where they spoke about topics that they were passionate about, which included vaccines. What was interesting about that time was that it was still largely decentralized. It was very hard for people to find that information. If you had a blog, I had a blog, you would remember that almost nobody read it. It was like crickets out there. But with social platforms, beginning in around 2007 to 2009 timeframe, the major innovation of social platforms was that they kind of put everybody onto the same space. You were there because your friends were there. This is called network effects. The experience became more enjoyable because you knew other people on the platform. You didn't feel like you were putting content out into a void. And also they made the barrier to entry very low. All you had to do was post a status update. So instead of writing a whole long blog post, you could just say what you wanted in a very short, concise format. And so you had that open content creation, the lack of any gatekeeper, that community dynamic. And then the other thing the platform solved was distribution. If you said something, someone would see it. And so fast forward, 10, 12 years, what we have now is this merging where media, broadcast media, peer-to-peer communication, everything is kind of on the same platform. Kind of visibility into what's a reliable source versus what something that some random person just said has largely disappeared. The amplification potential is there for anyone. So if you create sensational content, it's going to rise to the top. The algorithms privilege certain types of content, like on YouTube, me looking at a camera and telling a story, right? It's me telling my lived experience to the world. That authenticity really radiates. And that communication pattern has really fundamentally changed. We have a very mimetic environment. People are sharing things that they feel an emotional resonance with. Whereas a lot of the scientific communication is still very much more in this, we're going to write a long PDF, we're going to write an explainer, we're going to have very caveated language. We're going to communicate in the way that we've always communicated because these are very old institutions that continue to kind of move along in this way. And so there's a real divide in the type of communication, this thing that feels new and urgent and authentic that's coming from your friends who you trust versus this other type of ivory tower on high kind of style of communication that's still there. And that dynamic, that shift in how information is transmitted, the velocity of it, how viral it goes, it's the term we use on the internet too, right? Ways that it hops from community to community. That's somewhat unprecedented in communication architecture as well. Used to be much more broadcast and gatekeepers, and now it's much more peer-to-peer and participatory.
And I used to be kind of an optimist. Like 2010, I started using the word, I made up a word noosphere, K-N-O-W, building on this 1930s vintage idea of the noosphere, the planet of the mind. I was so excited by the this connectivity, that and blogging at the New York Times .earth on sustainability and connecting with people I never would have met. And boy, I feel like I tweeted this morning. I really am not feeling very good about the internet right now because of these properties and the exploitation of them you just described. And so now it's a good time to bring in Noel, who can give a sense with a sort of behavioral science background of your impressions. You had some very interesting thoughts recently about what's needed may not be necessarily, certainly not convincing people. We already know there's a bunch of behavioral science that's not really feasible. But what do you feel like despondent, hopeless, or still hopeful about where we are?
I'm really hopeful about uptake of COVID vaccine when we have one. There are a lot of questions about whether we'll have one at all. So I think it's far from certain that we will have a vaccine. It's far from certain that we'll have one soon. The agencies and organizations in charge of vaccination are moving at a deliberate pace. It's faster than usual, but it's also a very reasoned and sensible pace that's based on excellent science that will identify very, very safe vaccines. The next question is, of these safe vaccines, which actually help public health, which actually are going to help us be less likely to get infected or less likely to get sick or less likely to die from COVID? That's an unknown, a big unknown, and we don't know yet. And as a result, because we as scientists don't know the answer to this question, the public doesn't know either. And they're having to imagine a future. And the future that they're being asked about in national surveys is a single question. Would you get a COVID vaccine? I don't know, maybe, maybe not. It really depends on what is the vaccine. So when the vaccine is put in front of people, when it's actually an option, a real decision they can make, we may find people making different decisions than we expect. It may be based on the efficacy of the vaccine. It's only 40% effective, so maybe I don't want to get it, but well, I'm a healthcare worker. Actually, I really do want to get it, and maybe I don't have a choice because my job requires it. Or maybe it's 100% effective, like the HPV vaccine, where it really just nails it, and it's just outstanding in that way. That would be really encouraging. What about side effects? We don't know. Is it going to be the usual sore arm, and maybe you feel a little woozy for a few hours? That would be a typical situation. But what if there are really more fundamental harms? These new platforms that the vaccines are being developed on each have sort of their own idiosyncrasies, some of which are unusual in the vaccine space that we usually think of. But because of COVID being so deadly, it may be that older adults, for example, would be particularly keen on getting such vaccines. We don't know about the efficacy of the vaccine over age ranges. Does it really work well for teens? But what about people who are 40 years old? What about people who are 70 years old? The old shingles vaccine used to drop off in effectiveness for older folks, but the new one's really quite good across the different age ranges. So it might even be that since there's no such thing as a single COVID vaccine in our current world with over 130 candidates, it might be that we're talking about COVID vaccines plural, and that you have different vaccines for different populations at different times. So with all of that complexity, I think it's pretty amazing that we have half of the people, at least in the US, who are saying, let's get that vaccine. A quarter of them who are saying, no, I'm not feeling it. I don't know enough to set my mind at ease, to feel confident in this vaccine yet. And then another quarter of people have said, convince me. I'm unsure, so I want to talk to my healthcare provider and get this sorted out. So that's my general answer. But the specific and the very short version of the answer to your question of what increases vaccine uptake is the following. We know that sorting out the practical issues around vaccination is what works. Reminding people, making the cost low, making it available, setting up default appointments, and if needed, requiring the vaccines, but that may be a sort of a last step in the process, making sure that everything's sort of set up early on. In addition, as Heidi has studied and others have studied, we need to have confidence in vaccines. We can't pass strong vaccine policies, the kinds of policies that establish vaccination as being available and free and easy to get, if we don't have confidence that these vaccines are safe and effective.
So this is a good point for us to go around and get a bit of a discussion going on. What's the menu? You did identify some important realities there. One I think is clearly that it's not useful to think of the vaccine with a capital V as the solution to this mess we're in. Two, trust in messengers, whether it's physicians, using that idea of harnessing what already is known to work in terms of barriers to acceptance. But then getting back to Renee's world, there's this counterforce that, and the politics seems to, even without the internet, but certainly greatly amplifying from the internet, you have political positions and cultural positions that can really create barriers to even those things. So Heidi, back to you in the sense of what are the practitioners to do? What's the menu now for creating that landscape of possibility if and when these emerge?
Yeah. One I want to reinforce Noel's important point that, asking surveys now versus the day when you're offered it is going to be different. We've been doing pulse surveys with a number of different countries on willingness to take a vaccine, and it's like political opinion polling. It changes every few weeks.
Wow.
So, I mean, just in the UK, it went from 7% saying no, they wouldn't take it in mid-March, and then it dropped down to only 5 saying they wouldn't take it when the mortality rates were rocketing. And just last week, it was maybe 15% saying no way they would take one. So, people are also going to be weighing whether they feel like the threat is imminent. And if we're lucky, we're going to be getting a vaccine in 12 to 18 months. And let's see where we are then. So that's the other thing. But in the meanwhile, I think it's an important opportunity. We also have the background huge challenge of we're way behind on just basic childhood vaccines because this has been blackout time. People aren't going to the clinics. The access isn't there. The ordering rates from CDC has dropped. So, but we can use that opportunity of catch-up campaigns to kind of get conversations going around vaccines, around a potential COVID vaccine. Who's going to get it first? Yeah, I think the other issue is managing expectations because we can overpromise and then really let people down. So it's kind of juggling these different things. But I think the important thing is getting moving now with the conversations.
Yeah, in an active, ongoing way, in other words.
Yeah.
There was a good comment from Charles Rotter here. He says this is a good analysis. The takeaway should be don't lie to the public for their own good, which I think gets at what you were saying. In other words, honesty, transparency feels like an important thing, but at the same time, it's really hard. Politicians have a hell of a time dealing with uncertainty on climate change or any other issue. So Renee, oh, sorry.
No, I was just saying,
You're breaking up a little bit there, Heidi.
I just said, particularly when it gets around election. There's a lot of background noise.
Yeah, I know. I think, let's see. I'm not sure where that's coming from. Let's see. Hold on. I think Renee may have a fan on, or there might be a little bit of noise. No? Okay. Let's see here. Well, Heidi, just a second thought there on, what is it the media, what would be a particular thing that we could all tweak a little bit next week? Meaning whether me as a communicator, my friends in the media, that could start to take us in a bit toward that direction of transparency and continuity.
The big anxiety that people have is about, and Renee would also see from what is getting more traction quicker. We're certainly seeing in our surveys and our social media analysis that this issue of being too fast is a big concern. And I think, from a journalist perspective, we got to help the public understand why it's even possible to do it faster. What's the science? What's the technology? Right. What are the positive advances that are making this possible? Don't compare the speed of this one with the usual decade-long it takes for the older vaccines, because they were older platforms. And I don't think that message has gotten out there at all, really.
Well, that's an interesting point. Renee, what do you think about that? Are we failing, or is there a fix for that part of this, if you agree?
Well, I mean, as the comments that you've been putting up, the trust is paramount, right? And that's part of the problem. So people are getting their information in small groups, so small group dynamics. So when persuasive voices within small communities have a lot of influence, and this is not a thing that's unique to the internet. This is the structure of human society and communication for centuries. Technology just kind of changes the mediation of that process. It makes it a little faster, right? But that same idea that you're going to trust people who have proven themselves trustworthy to you in some way holds. And so what you have is these communities that persist, right? So people who are members of anti-vaccine groups, when you join an anti-vaccine group on Facebook, they're very, very active groups. They're very activist groups. They make people feel like they're really part of a mission. They are carrying out, they are taking the message to the people. They are fighting the good fight. And so that transformation of the kind of casual fence sitter into a passionate activist is something that happens because that's what those groups are designed to do. The way the platform amplifies that is that it amplifies your most active groups because it pushes interesting things into your feed. And so when you have highly active communities and you go to Facebook and you pull up your feed, it's going to show you the thing that's most likely to drive engagement. But again, this is that could be like your local, like literally beekeeping or chicken keeping group can top the feed too.
Right. And so this is
what communities like, the algorithm's relatively agnostic. It doesn't totally understand what it's amplifying, unlike a human curator or gatekeeper. But ultimately what it comes down to is what we've seen with our work on understanding the spread of narratives is that there's always these kind of like, maybe we can use the term super spreaders in this case. There are people who are active in many different groups. And so they serve as like the conduits of information from group to group. And then those people, of course, have other people who are in those groups, have other members who are active, who in turn spread to their kind of overlapping Venn diagram of interests. And so you see people acting as kind of pushers of this information as well. It's not just the algorithm. That creates an interesting dynamic because it means that things do hop from community to community. And what we've seen with COVID in particular is that things hop way far outside of the normal anti-vaccine or natural parenting or natural health communities because so many people are paying attention to COVID. And that's because they feel that it has a personal impact on their lives. So every random small business group, every random local New Brunswick bulletin board kind of group is receptive to this content coming in and then continues to amplify it going out, as opposed to something where it was just your normal run-of-the-mill anti-vaccine or kind of woo-woo post where it kind of dies when it hits a group that's disinterested. Everybody's interested, so this keeps moving. So it's been a very interesting dynamic watching that take shape and recognizing that these are people who are trusted within their community who are sharing this stuff. They're not scientists. They don't necessarily understand what's going on or what's legitimate, what's not. But they see it as something that resonated with them in some way, and so they chose to inform their community about it. And so a lot of the motivation behind that is actually it's quite altruistic. It's not malicious at all, and that also adds a layer of complexity, which is we don't see like doctors and physicians necessarily in all of these community groups serving as the debunkers and the science communicators. When this happened with Brazil and Zika, I'll just add this one last kind of piece on because I feel like I've talked long enough, but this was happening with Zika in Brazil a few years back. Misinformation about pandemics is not new. Misinformation about is not new. They tried to put doctors into the WhatsApp communities so that the doctors were actively participating so they could see what was coming in and serve as counters. And so doctors began to join a lot of these communities, and that was one of the innovations. In terms of like how public health figures became actively involved in that social media dynamic. But I don't think we've had to quite the same extent here.
And you would see that as a good thing, though.
I do, yeah. I think again, it's people still trust their pediatrician, right? People still trust their local hospital. They still go there to get treated if they're sick, and so it's a little bit different than the sort of CDC or WHO kind of organizations from on high type model of who knows what those people are doing, versus my local doctor. Oh, okay, sure, I have an understanding of who he
is this interesting movement in the U.S. The Tweetyatricians. They're on Twitter, and now recently they've invaded TikTok, which is good. The TikTok docs. But Renee, can I ask you a question to clarify two things? One is, my understanding is that the anti-vaccine posts tend to be a little more negative. So they actually they juice the algorithms a little bit. They sort of meet the needs of the algorithms by catching interest. But the other is that the folks who are anti-vaccine are often more disseminated. They rather than being having a relatively defined social network and a few connections, they have weak connections across many people. Are those your impressions of the literature?
Yeah, so in the literature, absolutely. I think tracking a lot of this has been challenging because the visibility into platform dynamics has not been great. When we did ours, we built classifiers to try to identify, like, how do you label 18,000 communities and decide what they are? Is it a QAnon community or a MAGA community or a generic conspiracy community? So there's a lot of flexibility as we're trying to think about the best way to model some of this stuff out. I think on the subject of juicing the algorithm, it's sensationalism. And people are motivated many times by anger and righteous indignation and a desire to share something that has been exposed, right? So they use the language of conspiracy theorists. They don't want you to know. We're telling you the secret knowledge that otherwise you wouldn't have had access to. And so there's a lot of that dynamic of you're being brought into a community that is going to reveal to you the truth about the world, and then in turn empower you to go out and continue to share that out. So we've compared the dynamics a little bit to cults. Not saying that it's the same in the substance, the kind of religious type dynamics that work there, but more the idea of secret knowledge in which you become an active participant in sharing it along. And that's been an interesting dynamic to see. I think the algorithms are really looking for what is engaging. They want to keep you on site. And so in order to do that, if it's a choice between showing you a post that has zero engagement that nobody's commenting on, which you'd have to be the first to, kind of break the ice and start a conversation, versus something that's already gotten 30 comments, that's got a lot of energy and activity moving around about it, you're going to see the latter thing. And oftentimes that's something that people have gotten outraged about.
The Tweetyatrician idea is a pretty cool one. I'm going to show that in a second. And Heidi, you're back. Sorry, yeah.
Andy, to your question about what sorts of things we should be engaging with on messages around COVID vaccines and trying to sort all this out, I really like the point that I think it was Heidi made about new vaccines. We've got to let go of that framing. This is going to be based on decades old science. Now, some of the platforms will have novel applications. There's going to be some novelty all around the perimeter and maybe some fundamental aspects. But we're going to have to try to frame this as a part of an ongoing scientific endeavor. With HPV vaccination, it has continued to be thought of as a new vaccine, even though it's 12 years old. And that undermines, 14 years old at this point, and that undermines uptake. It continues to cause misunderstandings. The second thing I'll point out is that we have an age graded vaccination that's really quite dramatic. So if you're age 0 or 2, in that very young age range, you might get 90% of your vaccines in a lot of different places. However, if you are an adolescent, you might get half or 3/4 of them. And if you're an older adult, maybe it'll be 40% of them. So that dramatic fall off over time is a problem to solve for any vaccine platform. It's one that we need to think about solving now. So we can think of the seasonal influenza vaccine as a test case for COVID vaccine. What can we do this fall and winter to increase seasonal influenza vaccination among older adults and among adults? That is something we really need to work on, in part because it'll help hospitals from getting overwhelmed, but also because we can learn some new things about what exactly it is that we can do. The final thing that I'll point out is that these acceptability surveys have shown some pretty dramatic differences among some subgroups. And one of the several disparities that I see is that Black people, at least in the United States, are much less likely to be interested in getting this vaccine currently. Those disparities are knowable and will very likely turn up in later data on uptake. That's something we need to address now. We need to start working with leaders in those communities, in media in those communities, with providers in those communities, and getting people back on board with vaccination, because Blacks are dying at least twice. Black people are dying at least twice the rate from COVID as other groups, and in some subgroups, the data show 5 and 10 times the rates. That's a social justice issue that we must address as scientists and as caring people.
Because that community is so exposed for various reasons, most of our listeners will understand. And that, I think I saw recently that some of the testing sites in some places are being done through churches, for example. So in other words, as you said, if the portal to testing is a church and not, which is obviously a community trusted place, that can create a different landscape of opportunity too, that kind of thing.
Well, in the U.S., the healthcare system is racialized. It has strong gradients on access, on the kinds of services that are delivered, on the ability to afford it, on places where you can go. And as a result, the health that people experience is different. And as you pointed out, also the jobs that some people have are also quite different. So that many lower paying jobs are more likely to be filled by people of color, Black people of color. And so that means that they are more likely to be exposed while doing a service job, working at a grocery store, or working in a nursing position, or working at a restaurant.
Right. So I wanted to circle back to Heidi in the context of your book that has just come out. It makes some key points. And this is still you said something earlier that I think we really need to circle back to, which is that even the landscape of understanding of the pandemic itself and COVID-19, and not just in the United States, which is where we think, there's a communication problem quite often, but in parts of Africa, et cetera, even that baseline awareness of the disease is still lagging in some places. So from the book, and your experience, you've identified, obviously, the landscape of problems, but what are some of the key learnings that can help us get to these points we've been talking about?
Well, I think, I talk about issues that are kind of have come to the fore in vaccines, but are not unique to vaccines. I talk about the phenomena of rumors in a way that is also a social function, that we're not going to get rid of it, and the risk of just chopping off the head of a rumor and not kind of looking at the roots, to put it simplistically. But then I talk more about dignity and distrust, risk perception, the volatility of opinion. That's been really, I think if there's one big change in the last decade, and certainly two, those old KAP, knowledge, attitude, practice studies that we would do around vaccines 20 years ago, they could sit on your shelf and you'd reference them for a few years. And frankly, that wouldn't be totally off the mark, because there was a more stable public sentiment, and you knew who the lower vaccinating groups were, and they were usually either a religious group or had some other alternative belief, but you kind of knew the landscape, and it pretty much stayed that way, with some volatility. But now it's really much more volatile. So I talk about that phenomena, about digital wildfires and contagion, and then this growing belief systems in not just religious, but nature and others. But in the technology, in the look at how the technology landscape has changed in some of the ways that Renee talked about, I do see also with that is a huge, and again, you framed it between the older, more traditional public health and the newer. I do think that we have a particularly bad gap now, because the older medical profession and authority, who are less at ease with things like social media, and are really anxious about going there because it's emotion, it's not fact, but that's where the publics are living. And I think as we get in a generation, and just to find some kind of positive angle in here, is When you start having doctors and health authorities who grew up with social media and are much more at ease with it, they'll get it, I think, in different ways than we're facing now. I mean, because we have transitions happening at multiple levels. And I think, the language will, adjust a bit. We also have a generation of kids growing up whose mothers were anti-vaccine, and they're challenging their mothers and saying, this is not okay. Your beliefs is preventing me from doing what I think is right, and I actually believe in science. So I think we've got a generational thing that could work for us.
I just realized I was muted. That takes us back to the conversation we had here on Wednesday with a couple of people, Claire Wardle and with Tim Nguyen from the UN, from the World Health Organization, about the this effort that's underway. I think a couple of you at least are involved with, which is sort of a 2-week symposium that will culminate on the 21st with a public finding, trying to develop a field you would call infodemiology. But to me, what's most interesting is just bringing people into the landscape from these different places, practitioners, psychologists, data analysis, like what Renee does, and others, so you can create that kind of intersections that you're talking about. So you can have doctors who are more comfortable online, so you can have an understanding of which messenger makes sense. So you can have an understanding of how to get that vaccine process, warp speed or not, more transparent and trustable. And I think, Noel, you were talking briefly about this before we started. So are you involved, and what's your sense of is this a fundamentally new effort compared to what had been happening?
Is your question about infodemics or about the communication about the risk of
this current symposium, the World Health Organization's attempt to sort of consolidate a lot of different disciplines into a conversation around this kind of thing?
The science in this area has been growing rapidly. We started off having, some rudimentary forms of social media, as Renee was talking about, and then scientists have just come up with new ways to study this. And Renee is one of the world experts in this, and there are other people who have been involved with this as well. So the field itself is been growing quickly and has several different branches to it. But the World Health Organization's embrace of it and naming of it in this way is really quite strategic and helpful. It'll raise the profile of it and draw resources that are strongly needed for us to be able to have new discoveries that will move public health forward.
And Renee, from your position, are you involved directly with the WHO's 2-week thing?
No, I'm not involved in this. Claire and I co-authored a paper for Aspen recently that came out as part of their Aspen-Sabin joint initiative. So she and I know each other well, and absolutely fantastic team working on it.
The thing that captures my attention about all of this is how parallel it is to the things I think about related to climate change and other issues where you have contested knowledge and a lot of internet activity that tends to mask the complexity and the need for transparency and all that stuff. It feels like this conversation, though, to me also is very underfunded, it's underappreciated, except for those who are involved with it to a certain extent. I don't know if that still feels true to all of you. Do people understand the momentousness of what we're all talking about here?
I think for the first point, I would say my work is not specific to vaccines. The Internet Observatory's work is not specific to vaccines. And anyone who goes and looks is like you have papers on China and Russia and Turkey and anti-vaxxers, hate speech, you name it. That's because we think about the internet as a system that's ripe for manipulation. So it's more of a communication infrastructure problem. It's more of a challenge of when you have built peer-to-peer participatory propaganda ecosystem, when you have built the structure for kind of small world networks and communities operating, with various forms of strong and weak ties mediated by algorithms, when you have that persistent space where people gather and share information, the topic is secondary to the behaviors and dissemination patterns and the structures of communication that are enabled. And so, I actually started in the space looking at the anti-vaccine movement back in 2015. But the kind of next outreach I got long before this was a thing that you could have a career in, when social network analysis was just kind of like a thing that marketers did sometimes, or data scientists, was actually terrorism was the second area where, I was asked, how does your work on anti-vaxxers and mapping communities and conversations on Twitter, can we put that to use understanding ISIS recruitment models on Twitter? Because that was the other thing that was happening in 2015. So
right.
a small group of people talking about an obscure California law to eliminate vaccine opt-outs using the exact same type of strategies that you had a terrorist organization building a virtual caliphate using, right? And so this was, we were not the first people to realize this. DARPA had programs for this. The government began to realize that this was really beginning to go off the rails. We knew that Russia was doing it in 2015 as well. We knew that state actors were doing this because it was just a way to use the old agents of influence model to influence communities, because now you could reach anyone anywhere in the world. So you can't think of it as a problem of like infodemic in the vaccine sense or in the health hesitancy sense. There are certain different interventions that the platforms are willing to do in those spaces because of the potential for harm, immediate harm, as opposed to political misinformation, which is still treated as more of a battle of beliefs. It'll sort itself out in the end, kind of policies on that are a lot vaguer. But it's a communication infrastructure issue.
I do think there is a growing understanding that there's a change in how communications happens. The public is, I think, starting to get that. I also think the public is just starting to entertain some of the scientific discoveries that Renee and her colleagues have been making about the nature of social media as a weapon, the nature of social media as a powerful social force to reshape entire countries' opinions, or at least subcultures that add up to a shift in political opinion potentially. So the science itself is still being made in the fundamental ways, really extraordinary new discoveries. And it takes a while to figure out how to turn that into simple language that the rest of the world can entertain and think about, and then at some point perhaps adopt as a belief.
Yeah. And infodemic is an old term. I mean, WEF was using it in 2006-07 in their digital wildfire analytics. So it's kind of evolved with the field quite a bit. But I think in terms of this workshop that WHO is having, I think it's more a statement that they're acknowledging that, Houston, we've got a problem, which was not the case for quite a while. And I think, they did acknowledge it was one of the top 10 global threats in 2019. That was
Right.
a huge leap. If I think of the biggest change since we founded the Confidence Project a decade ago, was a shift in recognizing there's a problem. And now I think it gives a bit of energy to the possibility to do something about it, because who was it, Freud, who said if you don't acknowledge you have a problem, you can't do anything about it.
And that gets back, I'll circle back to funding though. Lori Garrett on, this is way back, haha. Maybe two months ago on here, I did an early discussion with her, and she had posted a commentary in the Lancet about the fundamental underinvestment in basic resources. If we wanted WHO and or national agency situational awareness of this internet that Stanford has led on and others, when you look at actual staffing, when you look at actual bodies, it's microscopically small. And again, if the threat is as large as was described to progress on public health whenever that was just a year or so ago, that note on the top 10 impediments. How much of this is really, how much of it is conceptual and that it's early stage research, and how much of it is that we just have so few tools that are at the level of decision making to track it and do something about it? Renee, again, you probably have a sense of this overall.
Yeah, I think some of it is there are labs that are getting quite good at thinking about, kind of computational social science and various ways for identifying the problem. I would say the biggest gap is still encountering the problem, actually. So, and I'm not saying that if anyone wants to continue to, fund us, that's fantastic, and please do. I think as far as infodemics related to health misinformation, though, we can go so far as we can explain the dynamics. We can tell people, we can predict how something is going to happen. I mean, we were watching the pandemic, that video with Judy Mikovits. We were watching the evolution of that, the lead up to that for 3 weeks before that video went viral, because that video was like the 8th in a series of videos where they had tried to frame her as this whistleblower, this counter to Dr. Fauci and health authority. And it wasn't even obscure. I mean, you could just watch it happen. It was like making an influencer. This is how marketing works. The challenge becomes, first of all, what can the platforms do about that? Is there an ask there? Because saying, this is the same problem you have a lot of the time with things like terrorism and other things. You can't say like preemptively intervene, right? That's a thing that not everybody is comfortable with. So the question becomes, when the video comes out, how do you handle the debunking? How do you track the communities that it made it into and try to see, can you get the counter narrative? Can you get the correction, the fact check into those same communities? Then you have to try to understand, did the video have an impact? And impact is a very, if you're sharing, if it's anti-vaxxers sharing an anti-vaccine video into an anti-vaccine group, this is sort of like, they're sharing to the already converted. This is not a,
Right.
You don't react to that quite the same way as you would react to it if it was making its way into a new group that didn't know who Judy Mikovits was, didn't know that the, purported science here was all garbage. So finding which communities were actually impacted beyond just engagement metrics on a video, that's one of the kind of frontier areas in the kind of research that my team and I do. That definitely needs to be better funded. That's the kind of thing where understanding the impact of propaganda and communications in an instrumented age is an interesting challenge. Propaganda itself is not new. We used to just kind of assume that it worked, And so I believe that assumption still holds. I believe that it still does work, but quantifying the mechanisms by which it works and the interventions that work the best, those are the kind of two frontier areas. It's not that we have a much easier time finding this stuff now. We have a much harder time countering it. And that's where, with things like, who does your counter message come from? Who is your trusted community? That, I think, is where you have the challenge of, if people don't want to see, if people aren't going to be receptive to a correction coming from the CDC or WHO, who are they going to want to listen to? If the answer is the Tweediatricians, that's great. Then how do we make sure their content spreads, in that same way?
Yeah.
And reaches those same communities. Fund the content creators. I spoke with Mike after that pandemic video came out, because his video was he has a YouTube channel. He does great work. And his debunking video was one of the debunking videos that we saw hitting some of these communities. And I asked him about the process. How did you decide to do this? And he said, it takes him about 2 days, right? A day to research, a day to kind of write the script and to film. And so that's a 2-day lag between when the misinformation comes out and goes viral and reaches 8 million people, and when the debunkers are there and ready with calling fact check. And so we try to think about it now from the standpoint of, is there a way to timeline? Is there a way to take these early signals and provide them to people who have the capability to counter? Is there a way for the platform, since they're sort of infrastructure and pipes, to try to kind of push out the fact check more effectively than they currently are? And those are the areas that we're looking at with regard to countering.
So before we're going to head toward a close in a few minutes, and I want to end with some of these constructive paths, but I am going to take us down to the bottom before we go there by showing this. This is just a model. It's just one model, and I showed it a minute ago. Some of you are probably familiar with this paper. It came out recently by Neil Johnson at George Washington. And essentially what he's showing here is that you can project forward without intervention. In other words, if we just stick with,
I don't think you can. I'm sorry. I'm just not having it. And I love this paper. I think it's great. It's something like 3 billion tweets, and they found 100,000 people were tweeting, and some percentage of them were pro and some of them were anti, and it's based on sentiment analysis of tweets, and there's real problems with that. And then we're taking from that period of time, and we're gonna project forward, and without any really kind of substantive model, we're gonna project forward to 2045. I'm just not having it. So I don't I
Yeah.
love that paper. I think it's strong science. I think it says exactly what it says. During a 6-month period of time when there was a measles outbreak and there were fairly draconian measures in place, forcing people to behave certain ways in communities, even giving financial sanctions, that's new for us. It's a whole new world in many different ways, and it was necessary at the time. And it may have actually, some of those requirements for vaccination and so on may have actually stoked anti-vaccine sentiment. I am not at all convinced that this is what represents the general public.
But
Renee,
I
were you-
think that,
oh, sorry. Yeah, go for it, Heidi.
I mean, I think that prediction aside, I think there was one really important message in the analysis that's relevant to the need to do something about it, and that, I mean, to me, it was very, it captured the reason why the strategies are working better with the more anti-sentiment groups, anti-vaccine groups than the pro. Even without looking at what the messages are, basically you've got the pro groups being very homogenized, trying to get coordinated messages, trying to be very coherent, and they're stuck right there. And where you've got, with a lot fewer numbers, a much more nimble, responsive, jumping on the splintering, going into little groups out there. To me, the biggest value of that paper was, hey guys, in the pro groups, they're recruiting at a few hundred times faster than you are. And you want to know why? Look at the strategies they're using. And whatever, I mean, even without looking at what the content is, that's, I think, where the pro side is really falling behind and where it's something useful to action.
I'll agree with you. I think the dynamic analysis was really very interesting. That's the real strength. So that's where we learn things about how people interact over time. That's very useful. So in the characterization, in this one platform for this one period of time with these particular characteristics, we learned a ton. It's very informative in that way. And I alluded to some of the findings earlier when I made a comment. Yep.
There's a meta point, though, which Renee kind of alluded to, in the sense that it's kind of like Spy versus Spy, the old Mad Magazine comic that I grew up with in the 60s. And Renee, I think we're in an information environment where the truth is always lagging. That effort to get ahead of the wrong thing is lagging. I've had this discussion with Jay Rosen of NYU here, a media journalism professor, of this call and response mode the media have with Trump. Basically he can tweet anything that's fundamentally wrong, and then it's like this constant call and response catch-up routine that essentially amplifies that there's a dispute. And you all know, based on behavioral science, it kind of feeds these different audiences. And that curve, setting aside the limitations of that study, I still feel overall the media as we know them, meaning conventional media, the communication as we know it, meaning agencies and officials communicating, and even tweetiaticians, are still facing this sort of race that this is the negative part. I think it's a grand challenge to think we can get ahead of this, but I don't want to leave it there. So now give me your last couple of minutes of maybe Renee and then Noel and then Heidi, your like last charge to those who are seeking communication progress around a vaccine amid a pandemic.
The one thing I would say with the agencies in particular, and I'll use COVID-19 as an example, is that there was a real void created as people were looking for information. And this wasn't even related to the vaccine. This has been everything. So as the big institutions try to figure out what is the nature of this disease, what are the means by which it spreads, how do we understand transmission, how do we think about our children affected, you have a situation where the world is searching, literally the world in this case, usually it's smaller communities, and there's just nothing there. And when there's nothing from an authoritative source, whatever garbage anybody puts out with the right keywords and the right number of retweets is going to fill the void. And so while there's a need to be precise, and while scientists are much more constrained in what they can say and what they can do than the sort of just asking questions, wild speculation, we did see folks like Carl Bergstrom and some of the biologists and a few people who had worked in health in the Obama administration try to come in and counter that by providing information to the public in as near to real time as possible as they internalized and understood new things. But things like the mask guidance really eroded confidence in the institutions. And I think in some ways, they haven't even really done a full reckoning or addressing of that. And then we're going to expect them to kind of, run the show on convincing people worldwide that a vaccine is safe. They've got to be doing that, repairing those relationships and improving those communication patterns now, with 6 months lead time if they're going to get anywhere. Because when you don't have, we don't have time to wait 3 months for a solid answer. You can communicate to the public, this is our probabilistic assessment, in lay people English, of course, but this is what we think is likely to happen. This is where we see things going. And I think that's better than being reticent and just not communicating at all.
I was muting myself again. So Neil, your last go-to
Sure.
charge.
I'll say maybe 3 things. One is that there is some evidence that overall confidence in vaccine may actually be going up, that the appetite for vaccines may have increased. And that's in parallel with an anti-vaccine lobby. These are political activists looking to harm public health. The anti-vaccine lobby is also becoming sophisticated. They're using new techniques that they have not used before. And techniques for political organizing as well as social media organization. Those are some things that, to be honest, I've learned from Renee and others. That's very new. So we both have, I think, it's sort of a race, but we're racing. There are pressures in slightly different directions. The second thing is that we have a drop in vaccination rates that's not fully fixed itself. So the National HPV Vaccination Roundtable that I chair has called together national experts and national leaders in vaccination to talk about what to do about the drop in vaccination. And the current data suggest that although there was maybe a drop by 40 or 50% in childhood vaccination, 0 to 6, we bounced back. But when you look at adolescents, we might still be down by about 45%, at least for HPV vaccine. And that's very important. That's something we need to address immediately. If we do not address this, we may take our opportunity for eliminating cervical cancer as a public health threat and push it off by decades. So this is a current and pressing threat in my mind. One of the challenges is that parents don't necessarily know what pediatricians' offices are doing or whether it's safe. And they've not done a great job about communicating. I know exactly what my grocery store is doing. I do not know what my pediatrician is doing. I can tell you that my grocery store is going to have everyone wearing a mask, that they've actually cleaned the cart before I get there, and that while I'm there, we're all going to be 6 feet apart. And that's great. When I go to my pediatrician's office, I honestly can't tell you what happens when I walk up the stairs. Where am I going to wait? What safety equipment is going to be used, and how safe am I? We have to have pediatricians actively, and other physicians actively reaching out and saying what's happening in their practice so that we know. That kind of active communication is really important. And then finally, we talked a little bit about communication plans. I do think that's important. I'm a member of the World Health Organization's Global Vaccine Safety Advisory Committee. They're doing they have a subcommittee on risk communication. So they're putting together plans, but all of this again it's a bit lofty. It's folks in Geneva and all over the world who have elite places in society, and that's all fine. But we do need to start coming up with a more immediate plan. I think that's really smart, and that's something I've heard very clearly during this discussion. There are also efforts happening here in the United States, but I agree with the sentiment I think shared on this webinar that we need to have more frequent substantive communication from experts, and those experts will help lead things. And we also have to have that not cut down by people in high political positions.
Yeah, that seems to come through over and over again. And I do think tweetiatricians, that's new to me, believe it or not. And this is even in 2017. The more that the expertise you were just talking about in Geneva, or whatever comes out of those committee meetings, can be disseminated through practitioners, nurses, social workers, doctors, people especially in vulnerable communities, the better off we are. So Heidi, the floor is yours to close this out. What's your next step? What's your world like the next few months in terms of making progress here toward a rational approach to vaccination around this pandemic? Oh, you're muted. Hold on. I'm sorry. There you're all set.
I think we have to expand beyond the rational and just get more of the emotions in it, not to abandon the rational, but I think that's I think that's one point. I think in the tweetiatricians, you can see probably the age cohort is what that younger generation I was talking about, which I think is great. And not that we don't have some older folks actively on their Twitter all the time running the country, but so that's not always a generational thing, but just in terms of the from the health and medical perspective. But I think we've touched a lot of the really important points. The one thing that we're working on now more is, we're doing survey and the social media analytics and a number of on the ground qualitative research, and trying to, I think, connecting the dots, because this stuff that's online doesn't stay online. It jumps off. In different parts of the world, depending on where you live. In Africa, somebody will take a picture of a "What's up?" They'll go print it at the local copy shop. They'll tack it on a tree. They'll read it on a radio. The local imam's going to read it, in his discourse in the evening. The anti-vaxxers are. They're getting incredibly dynamic. They know the restrictions are coming down the pipeline on the social media spaces. They're going onto more open spaces, but they're also jumping onto, what we could think of as old-fashioned billboards. But, they've got a point, because they're capturing people who are not in their echo chambers. They're capturing people who might be driving by, walking by, and have never thought about questioning a vaccine. And it says, have you really thought about what's inside a vaccine? So I think we have to continue to do some of the great social media analytic work, and the type of work Renee is doing is an insight into it beyond the vaccine space, but also to contextualize it with how is it connecting up with other forms of communication, and where the points in that communication where we can intervene. And I think we just went over our hour, but
no, this is fine.
Thank you.
No, this is great. Yeah. Thank you so much for being here. It's an honor to have all of you here, taking valuable time to connect with audiences this way. Folks should know that as soon as we're done, this gets saved on 4 different platforms: Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, and Twitter via Periscope. And so it's a living resource. And I'm hoping we can revisit with you periodically to see how we're doing. We are going to do a session here on the 24th of July after that summary coming from the World Health Organization's Infodemiology meeting. And again, this is Sustain What? It's a global conversation identifying solutions to the complicated, shape-shifting, and epic challenges of humanity's great acceleration, and now the great pause enforced on us by biology. Our prime focus is making sense of and getting the most out of the planet's fast-forward information environment. It's the one Earth system changing faster than the actual environment. I'm really glad there's an Internet Observatory at Stanford and so many other people working hard to try to explore it and rationalize how to work with it. This webcast is produced as part of my work building Columbia University's new Earth Institute initiative on communication and sustainability. As soon as we're done, share the link you've been watching on with friends and circles far and wide, and get in touch with me with ideas. Look at the scrolling info at the bottom of the screen to find information on how to do that. And thanks again to all of you for being part of this. Have a good weekend, and keep at it.
Have a good weekend, folks. Bye.